All right, so it's currently 2:02, so I'm going to go ahead and get this started for today. Thanks to everyone who's joining us for what is in New York anyway, a pretty gloomy, rainy Tuesday. My name is Eric Bias. I'm a program associate with Russell Sage, and my pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Stephen and Deandra, who will introduce themselves right now.
Sure. My name is Stephen Glauser. I'm a program officer. My pronouns are he, him.
Hi, I'm Deandra Durand. I'm the program assistant and my pronouns are she, hers.
And this is a webinar on the Russell Sage Foundation's program application guidelines and best practices. So before we start, I'd like to go over just a few logistical housekeeping notes. This meeting is being recorded, so if you need to duck out in the middle for whatever reason, we'll host this on our website maybe a couple days after this is concluded. We ask that all of the participants who would like to ask questions, please do so via the Q&A function, not the chat. It's just a little bit easier for us to keep track of and to make sure we get everyone that we want to answer questions for. We also ask that you please refrain from asking very specific project-related questions during the talk. This is intended to be a very broad, general webinar that's supposed to help everyone. And if you're trying to ask very specific questions, it can be a little bit distracting for folks. So if you have very specific questions related to a very specific project, you can just email us separately after the talk. And to do that, of course, you could just do that at programs@rsage.org, which you will hear that that email address mentioned multiple times during the talk. So for a little bit of history as to who we are, the Russell Sage Foundation was established in 1907 by the wife of Russell Sage, Margaret Olivia Sage, for, quote, the improvement of social and living conditions in the United States. Back then, we were dedicated to a whole bunch of different things like labor reform, public health, and housing. If you are local to New York, you might be familiar with the neighborhood of Forest Hills. The Russell Sage Foundation was responsible for developing a neighborhood in Queens called Forest Hills Gardens that was supposed to be originally for affordable housing. Now it's not necessarily that. But after 1945, we've become pretty much dedicated to the advancement of social science research in the US. Stephen, I think that's you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry, everyone. I'll chat a bit about our funding priorities. The Russell Sage Foundation has 4 core program areas. They are on behavioral science and decision-making and context. You may, if you have been familiar with our work in the past, this was previously known as behavioral economics, and we had a special initiative on decision-making and human behavior in context. We sort of have smooshed the two of those things together. And we sort of think of this as both behavioral economics and behavioral economics for non-economists is what fits under this program. We have a long-standing future of work program. This has been, I think, a fad that everyone has heard about in the past few years, but ours has been around since 1994. So we're interested in all things labor market, about the quality of work, things like the minimum wage, things like worker power, things like monopsony. All of these things go under the future of work program. We have a race, ethnicity, and immigration program. This was also previously 2 different programs. We had a cultural contact program and an immigration program, and a few years ago, they were sort of combined into one. Under this, we do have a ongoing special initiative that's co-funded by the Carnegie Corporation on immigrant integration. That sort of fits underneath it. And then we also have a inequality program that was previously known just as social inequality, but apparently that was leaving some folks out who didn't think maybe they should apply to this one. But so we wanted to clarify, it is now known as the Social, Political, and Economic Inequality Program. I will say that for Russell Sage, and this may not be true for other funders, but for Russell Sage, we don't. We recognize that there's a lot of overlap between these program areas. It's everyone can think of ways that, say, race and ethnicity intersect with inequality. So you'll hear this a few times through this talk, but when you apply to us, you pick the program that you think is most appropriate for your project. And if we think it fits better somewhere else, we'll just move it over and it's fine. I know that other funders say that you need to be very specific about which program you apply to, but at Russell Sage, that's less important. I will also say that you should pay attention to our LOI deadlines for our research grants, because we don't always accept all of these programs at every deadline. But for the upcoming November research grant deadline, we are accepting all of them, so you're fine for this fall. We also on our website have RFPs that are occasionally updated. I'll say we strive for them to be regularly updated, but these RFPs have example topics and example research questions that show the types of things that we're interested in each of these program areas. And those are a great thing to read through to see which one would fit better. Yeah, I think that's good. You can go to the next slide, Eric. So for this is also relatively new. We've updated our budget amount limits for our research grants. You can maybe think of it as like an inflation adjustment, but we do this every few years. So the maximum, there are two levels of funding. We have trustee awards and presidential awards. The only thing that is different between the two of them is who gets final say over the funding decision. Everything over $75,000 gets decided by the trustees, and everything below $75,000 gets decided by the president with us as staff members. But the review process is identical. It's a two-step LOI and then proposal. That's the main thing to remember. You shouldn't be confused by the difference between, like you'll see things on our website talking about presidential awards or trustee awards. But the main thing you have to remember is that there's no difference in terms of how you actually apply. The LOI process is the same. The page limits are the same. The budget rules are pretty much the same. The main difference being that on everything below $75,000, we don't pay indirects because we want all of the money to go towards the research costs.
So to give a little bit of a background on our review process, we have 3 deadlines per year, typically in May, August, and November. Every LOI that we receive goes under an internal staff review, which is basically just to determine eligibility, if it's in line with our program areas and our research goals. And we'll select a subset of these to go out for external peer review, in which we'll select maybe, say, 3 or 4 external peer reviewers who are experts in the particular research area that you're proposing a project for. Once those reviewers come back with comments and make a recommendation as to whether or not we should submit a full proposal, we'll mask those comments and send them out and invite a full proposal. Those full proposals are automatically given an external peer review, sometimes by the same reviewers, but not necessarily. And we'll invite those PIs to respond to the comments they received during the LOI stage. If it's a trustee award, then the proposal will be given a review by an advisory committee that is specific to each program area. So if you are submitting under a future of work program, then the future of work advisory committee will look at this specifically, and they will make a recommendation as to whether or not that is submitted to the board for a final vote, which in this case will be in June of 2023. If it's a presidential level award, after a proposal has been responded to in terms of the comments, then it's given a final vote by the president, and that would be the final step for that one. So there's also another program priority that we want to highlight for a November 2nd deadline, in addition to the research grants for our pipeline awards. These are for tenure track assistant professors, adjuncts, and teaching faculty who have not received any kind of grant from Russell Sage in the past. They're for 1-year grants of up to $30,000, and you can use these for summer salary, data collection, research assistance, course buyouts, some things that would not necessarily be used or not necessarily be allowable for our regular research grants program. The good thing about the pipeline grants program is that there's a little bit more involved. There's a mentorship component. There's a capstone conference the following year in which you have the opportunity, if you're granted, to present your work with some of your peers in the cohort. And travel and lodging, of course, would be sponsored by Russell Sage. And another important difference would be that it's a one-step application process. There's no LOI for this. You just submit a 7-page proposal along with a CV, and it's given a review from there. And you can also find more information on the website with the website listed here, and also by clicking on the QR code on the screen.
So I think it would be helpful for us to really clarify some key differences between these two pools. The pipeline grants competition, which has a deadline on November 2nd, and our regular research grants, which have a deadline the following week. As Eric just mentioned, the pipeline grants competition is really designed for early career researchers. So that's assistant professors, both tenure and non-tenure track, and lecturers, and teaching professors who received their PhD after January 1st, 2013. He detailed a couple of the differences already, but it's nice to have it directly on one page here. New this year for the pipeline grants competition, we are not requiring a budget or budget justification at the time of application. I really want to highlight that. We're really trying to reduce the applicant burden at the time of application. You don't have to go talk to your Office of Sponsored Programs or your Office of Research at your university to get an approved budget. We are going to review these projects without any budget details. And then when we make our funding decisions, we'll work together with the grantees to come up with a budget that's within our rules and fits all of our compliance issues, et cetera, et cetera. The main thing you have to remember about the research grants is that there are 3 different deadlines a year. So if you don't apply at one, you can always hit the next one, but with the caveat that I mentioned earlier that you need to occasionally pay attention because we don't always accept all program areas at every deadline. The last thing I'll mention is that depending on the applicant pool for the pipeline grants competition, if we get inundated with hundreds and hundreds of applications, we have a limited pool of funding for that. We may draw a line somewhere that says, oh, these folks have let's say, a history of successful grant funding at other institutions. Maybe we'll move their application over and treat it as an LOI. Or we may also look at it, be like, oh, this group of folks are at very well-resourced institutions. We'll move them over and treat them as LOIs instead. We don't know what that's going to be because we don't know how many applications we're going to get. I just want to raise the possibility that you may apply to the pipeline grants competition and then find out that you're being treated as an LOI. And we'll do that internally and we'll let you know that that's happening, but we're just trying to be transparent. Eric, you can go to the next slide. This is just a heads up that for grad students, if you have grad students or if there are any grad students on the call, we do have a dissertation research grants program that was new last year. So this is going to be the second time we run it. It has a deadline on February 1st and it's designed for ABD students. We really want it to be sort of the late stage research. We want the funding to go to the research and things like that, not necessarily to like the writing stage. And up to half of the $10,000 can be for a stipend that you can do. You can pay your rent, you can go to the restaurants, you can do whatever you need to live, that's fine. And similarly to the pipeline process, it's a one-step application process. You just have a 5-page single-space proposal with a CV. And you can see more information here. With all of these things, if you have additional questions, I really encourage everyone to email us at programs@rsage.org because we can answer specific questions. And if we have time, we can even set up one-on-one meetings with you to chat about your specific projects or potential projects.
We have a bunch of other funding mechanisms that we'd probably like to talk about as well. We have a number of visiting fellowships, including visiting scholars, visiting researchers, and visiting journalists. And that gives folks the opportunity to come and work and collaborate in our offices and share ideas, bounce ideas off of each other. We have a really great lunch in a cafeteria in which folks can talk about their projects together and enjoy the intellectual camaraderie of the office itself. We also publish an open access interdisciplinary journal, RSF, the Russell Sage Foundation Journal of Social Sciences. And we also publish our own books. And we also run a number of summer institutes for early career scholars and PhD students, namely in behavioral economics and proposal development. And you can find more detailed information, of course, about all these things on our website. And for most of these, there's no restrictions based on citizenship, country of study, or country of employment. You could be a Canadian scholar affiliated with a British school, and you could totally apply to all of these things. So to give a little bit more insight on the review process and what we ask of reviewers, I'd want to talk a little bit more about the different tiers of review that is involved with our process. So for program staff, we internally screen all the LOIs we receive. And again, we just try to assess the fit with our program areas, try to slot projects within those if we think that it might be better served in a different one. And we want to check against our main research goals and guidelines. For the external reviewers that we solicit, these are best thought of as interdisciplinary. So for instance, if you are a quantitative researcher, an economist, for instance, and you're submitting a project in that line, we might try to solicit reviewers who are a psychologist or a sociologist. So we want you to be sure that when you're crafting your LOI, that you're aware that a person that has a different background might be looking at it as well. So just have a general sense of the literature in a different discipline than your own. But generally, these are chosen based on their expertise in a given research topic that you're doing your research on. Our advisory committees, similarly, are interdisciplinary. They're standing, so we try to get at least 1 or 2 advisory committee members to review all of our LOIs. But every trustee level proposal will come up against an advisory committee review, and they have the final determination on which get moved to the board for a final decision. And again, the RSF Board of Trustees makes all the funding decisions for any kind of proposal that is above $75,000.
So I'll talk a little bit more about what we ask our reviewers, and just to jump on something that Eric said that I think is really good to repeat is when we don't have a standing panel that sees all of the applications and then selects which one should move forward. We sort of customize the reviewers for each proposal. And that means that we are picking people based on topical expertise or methodological expertise. So you could imagine someone reading your paper or your proposal may be a topical expert, but may use a different method than you. So then we're sort of asking them to see if your project is well framed within the literature as they know it. And then you could also imagine someone who is a methodological match and has used this, maybe familiar with the data or familiar with the methods you're proposing, but they don't know as much about the topic. And so we're asking them to really dive into that part of your research design. And obviously, if we can find them, and we usually try to, there are people who fit both of those categories. They are both topical and methodological matches for what you propose. And so we're asking for their opinion on the proposal as a whole. And so really what we ask these reviewers is to take a look at the research question or questions being proposed. Are they clearly stated, and are they well framed and supported in prior theory and empirical work? And then this is the main thing we're asking them. Is the proposed RD? Are these the appropriate data and methods to answer the question that you're posing? And then we have some other questions like, is the investigator qualified? what is the contribution of this project going to be? Is it going to be a book? Is it going to be a couple papers? Is it going to be a paper in a high-level journal? Or is this sort of going to be one to just marginally advance the literature a little bit? And then finally, we do ask them to add anything that they would help, anything that they help would think would strengthen or improve the project. And we really feel that this part of the peer review process is of value, even if you don't get funded at the foundation. We hope that the feedback you get from this very customized panel of reviewers just for your submission will be helpful for you to seek funding at a different institution, to come back to us at a future deadline, or even just as you do your project on your own. All right, you can go to the next one here. And all of that being said, you have to get to the peer review stage to get that benefit. And unfortunately, we do have this sort of internal screen that we do. You can think of it as a desk reject. And internally, depending on the number of applications we get at a deadline, we will reject anything from half to 2/3 of the applications that come into us, because we just don't have the reviewer capacity to review everything that we receive. The main reason that folks' projects are rejected are that they are not an RSF funding priority. This is the biggest bucket. Most things fall into this. The project just doesn't fit with one of our program areas. It's not focused on the US, or it focuses on outcomes that the foundation doesn't currently think is a priority. This includes things like pretty routine, what we would call routine analyses of existing publicly available data. We don't want you just running a regression on the ACS and then asking us for funds to do that. We would want something a little bit more creative. You have to bring something, if you're linking data sets, if you're including a qualitative component, if you're including some original survey data, or all of these other ways are a way to make things more, we would think of them as more interesting. We don't fund things like operational support. We generally don't fund program evaluations. We don't fund animal studies. And we don't fund things that focus on health outcomes or issues around educational curriculum. The second biggest reason that things don't get funded is that we see a project as too preliminary. And this is really sort of, you have to try to find this sweet spot where it's the right time for the foundation to get involved. We want to see some feasibility. We want to see preliminary data if you have it and if it's possible to have. What we don't want is sort of a half-baked idea that's like, oh, I'll develop a survey instrument and then we'll go figure out this thing. We want to sort of see like a pre-tested survey instrument, even if you did that on like Mechanical Turk or something like that. Or if you're planning on doing qualitative interviews, we want to see that you at least have a plan about how you're going to about getting your sample. Who are you going to talk to? Why are you picking these people to talk to them? Why are they the right people to talk to answer the research question you posed? We want to see this well-developed research design. If the research design is sort of fuzzy and not all there, we're going to think of this as sort of too preliminary. I will say that there is, again, a caveat here. You say, see the pipeline grants. We are willing, for pipeline grants competition, we're willing to take a look at projects that are a little bit more preliminary in the process than we are for our regular research grants. And part of that is that we understand that some people at less resource institutions can't get the funding to do a pilot project. So we understand that. We also understand that maybe that because the pipeline grants competition only has one deadline a year, if you don't have the pilot data now, but you're going to have it in the spring, you don't want to miss this deadline. So we understand that as well. So if you have any questions about where your project is and whether you think whether we want to think if it's an appropriate fit for the foundation now, you can send us an email with like a little one-pager or an abstract or something like that, and we can sort of have a discussion about whether you should wait a little longer. Oh, you need to go get a little bit more preliminary data and preliminary findings if you have them, or if we can think that it's appropriate now. And then the last reason that folks get rejected before external peer review is just sort of poorly written LOIs or proposals, lack of clarity, design issues, the data is clearly the wrong data to answer the question, these sorts of problems. So just make sure that you really tighten things up when you're submitting, and just do one last read through before you hit submit. Use all of the pages we give to you. Like we will occasionally see if we give you a 4-page limit, someone will turn something in with 2 pages and then there's not enough details there. Maybe they have those details, but they didn't put them in. And so really use the space that we give you. I think that happens more often than I can really understand. And I'll say, don't just copy and paste a proposal that you sent off to NSF or NIH or a different funder. Really try to at least frame it in a way that it is relevant to the Russell Sage Foundation.
So some common pitfalls and some best practices, and a lot of these are going to piggyback on what Stephen has just mentioned. We want you to make sure before you apply that the project is a fit with the foundation's funding priorities. Again, you can find on our website very detailed RFPs on all of our program areas. And if you have like any kind of question on whether or not something fit or doesn't fit, you can just send us an email at programs@rsh.org. We'll be happy to look at a 1-page abstract or talk with you on Zoom or on the phone to try to workshop an idea. As long as it's not like a week before the deadline, of course, because we're a small staff, we're only like 5 people. We want your question to drive the proposal. We want you to map your research design data and methods tightly to the research questions. We don't want you to come at us like a hammer in search of a nail, like you have access to this really great data source, but you're kind of looking for a question to answer with it. We want it to be the other way around. We want these 2 things to match and for you to pull the most valuable research that you can out of it. We want your proposal narrative to also be balanced. Like Stephen mentioned, we don't want you to spend too much space on your investigator qualifications, for instance. You don't need that. We can get that from your CV. Similarly, we don't really need a section or a paragraph of your LOI on the fit and connection with the foundation's program priorities. We can get that just from reading the text of it. Again, we want you to spend the most of your time and your effort on developing your research design and your methodology, and we want you to use the limited space that you have in your LOI for single-space pages to do that kind of work. We want you to provide sufficient information for reviewers to evaluate the appropriateness of the methods. We want, again, it's basically just put as much depth and effort in giving us as much information as possible on your research design. Similarly, we want you to use language that is appropriate to your project. Like, for instance, if you're doing a descriptive project, make sure that your language is descriptive in nature and not causal in nature. If you're doing a causal project, we want your language to reflect that as well. Don't get them mixed up because that's a common pitfall. We want you to show understanding of the strengths and limitations of your design methods and analyses. And if you get reviews, respond graciously and in depth. And also, I will say this with as much enthusiasm as possible, try to answer any kind of critique or question that a reviewer does express to you in your comments. There have been several times in the past when we've received responses back and they didn't quite respond to every kind of critique. These may get back to the same reviewer and they will notice this, and it has affected the review in the past or the final decision. So try to make sure that you respond to every kind of critique and every kind of thing in question. And you don't necessarily have to agree with them, but just back your assertions up. And you have basically virtually unlimited space to do so. There's no kind of word limit with your responses. I'm not going to say it's quite unlimited, but it's much more, it can be more than 20 pages, to say the least. Again, check our website for anything you need. There are example LOIs proposals on there. So if you'd like to take a look at what got stellar reviews in the past, those things are hosted up there, both for LOIs and proposals. And you could also use them for pipeline proposals and
Eric, we actually have some example pipeline and
Oh, we do?
dissertation research grants proposals up there as well.
Be better.
That's relatively new. But I will say that I think the most helpful thing that folks can learn from the example ones are sort of that how to construct your narrative. Like, what is the ratio? How much did they dedicate to the lit review? How much did they dedicate to the data and methods? What did they not spend a lot of time on? And we really tried to pick some examples that show the breadth of the social sciences. So there are some from various disciplines. You'll see an example from an economist, an example from a psychologist, an example from a political scientist, sociologist, et cetera, using different methods. So some are proposing to do original surveys, some are doing qualitative interviews, some are doing some cool things with administrative data. So there's all sorts of different things there. Hopefully you can find something in there that's helpful and relevant to the project that you're proposing.
And I'll finish by saying that please register for our Flux portal in advance. Before you apply to any kind of project that you're wanting to apply for, you have to first register in Flux first. And this is a manual process. We as staff look at these things and make sure that they pass before we give you access to the portal. And things can get a little bit clogged right before a deadline. So if you're thinking about applying, do so now. Just do so at least 48 hours in advance. And actually, finally, we do receive many, many very good proposals that we can fund. It varies by funding round, but sometimes we receive as many as 700 and sometimes we receive as many as 100. And it's like, we can only fund so much. So if you don't get in the first time, don't get discouraged. Learn from the reviews that you get. If you don't get reviews, you can also reach out to us and try to get some more information on why a certain thing didn't pass a desk review and apply again. Like, we're happy to help you try to get as much funding as you possibly can get out of us. Just as a little bit of an overview on our budget guidelines, it's useful to have an idea of this before you apply, just so you know what is required, what is allowed and what isn't. At the LOI stage, you don't need to submit any kind of full budget. All you really need to do is to submit maybe a sentence or two outlining your main budget areas, like I am requesting X amount for salary supports and X amount for data collection, something like that. If you're a PI with a salary of up to $250,000, you can request summer salary support of up to $25K for a 1-year grant and up to $50K for a 2-year grant. Course buyouts are considered on a case-by-case basis, but they're allowed for pipeline grants. Student research assistant is allowed, but we do not allow tuition costs. Any kind of crowdsourced workers, like via MTurk, must be paid a minimum wage of $15 an hour, or whichever is higher in your locality. And we don't necessarily pay for travel for dissemination or for conferences, unless it's for pipeline grants, in which it would be limited. And of course, you can find more information on our website under our budget guidelines. So that's about it for everything. We'd like to thank you for joining us. And if you have any questions, feel free to shout out in the Q&A box, and we'll stay on for a little bit more minute or a little bit longer just to answer those questions.
And I'll we've said it a few times through here. Please reach out to us at programs@rsage.org. This is really what we're here for. That email address is answered by the 3 of us here on this call, and that's where we'll be able to answer very project-specific questions that you have, like, is this a good fit for the Russell Sage Foundation? Oh, is this at the right stage for the Russell Sage Foundation? Those sorts of questions, you can certainly send them to us there, and we can oftentimes, as long as you're not a couple of days ahead of the deadline, we can even set up a Zoom call to chat with you one-on-one. But yeah, I'll take a couple of the questions in the Q&A and just answer them live. The first one is about how many weeks before full proposal deadline do you learn if you're going to be invited for one? We try to give a month. We try to give a month ahead of the full proposal deadline, so for you to turn in that full proposal.
Someone is asking if the full proposal has to be 20 pages or it can be between 15 to 18. we would recommend that you use as much space as possible, because that's just space that you could use to flesh out your argument, flesh out your research. I guess you could say it doesn't have to be, but we would strongly recommend that you use as much space as you possibly can. Someone is also asking if these slides will be available somewhere. This is being recorded and it will be hosted on our website maybe in a couple days' time at most. So you should be able to see it there under our tips for a grant writing success page, which is easily accessible on the front page.
Eric, I'll jump in and answer some of the pipeline related questions that are on here. The first one is that I see is, do I need to describe the budget expenses for a pipeline program? I would actually say that we don't want to see too much of that, because it's sort of like an opportunity cost. If you spend too much space in your proposal talking about that, it's space that you could spend on your research design or details about your data or methodology, et cetera. So you can give us something like, and this goes for LOIs as well as the pipeline program, something like one sentence that is, I intend on asking for $30,000 for research assistance, summer salary, and data access, period, one sentence. That's all we need at that early stage. Any more than that, we don't need, and there'll be time for that later when we ask for specific things like the full budget and the full budget justification. But at that first initial application stage, don't give us more than sort of like big bucket, one sentence or two sentences at most. There's a question about whether you can submit 2 different projects for a pipeline grant consideration. I would actually say usually for our LOIs, we allow multiple submissions, but for the pipeline grants competition, we only want you to submit 1 submission. For these deadlines specifically, you can only apply to either the pipeline grants competition or the research grants. We don't want you to apply for both.
Someone is asking about our reporting requirements. We require a financial report and a narrative report 2 times for a full 2-year grant and once for a 1-year grant. I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking, but.
And well, I'll say like the content of those narrative reports, we sort of want to know, what findings did you have? What did you learn? Are you going to publish this have you submitted this to a journal? Are you going to present this at a conference? Those are the sorts of things we want to know. And that's about it.
Someone is asking if the deadlines are the same each year. Roughly, yeah, pretty much. They might change, like give or take like a buffer of a week or so, but generally they are the same. And if you look at our upcoming deadlines page on our website, they're telegraphed for the next couple of rounds.
There's a question about, sorry, go ahead.
As for the ones that are like the DRG, it's pretty much the same every year. But as for LOIs and such, it's essentially the same, yeah.
It'll be the same time of year. If like if the first falls on like a Sunday, we might move it or something like that, but it'll usually be the same time of year. For the pipeline program, do you need to show preliminary results? That sort of, it depends. Like that's one of those things where why don't we have a conversation about where your project is and we can sort of figure it out. It's sort of a moving target. And I saw a couple different people were asking for where on our website the examples applications are. If you go to our tips for grant writing success page, then you'll see it underneath there. There's a little examples of successful applications, but I think we've also posted the link as an answer to the question.
Someone is asking if a deadline can be extended if one has difficulty in submitting. It depends on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes they're a little bit lenient and can extend it by a day or 2, but it honestly just depends. It's not a hard deadline, so to speak. But
I would also say that a lot of folks sort of procrastinate because they think that they can improve their project up until the deadline. Like somehow you can improve your narrative up until the deadline. There's no punishment to submitting early. If you find a typo later after you've submitted, you can email us and we'll just upload the new one for you. That's fine. There's no negative to submitting early, and then you at least know. And then you don't have to have that sort of question about whether we'll grant an extension or not. because in reality, that's sort of up to the discretion of either the program directors or the president of the foundation. And it can be fuzzy. Sometimes maybe we're lenient, and then other times it's like, oh no, too many applications came in. We don't want to be lenient this time. There's a question about whether you need to explain which program issues that you are submitting in the proposal. This sort of goes into if you do a good job explaining the research question and the project that you're going to do, we're pretty good at figuring out if we think this is of interest to the foundation or not. So you don't have to sort of spend a paragraph or two saying, oh, this fits with this part of the RFP that you say. You don't have to map it like that. Sort of give us a little bit of credit. We read a lot of these. We know what we think we're interested in. If you have questions about if it's a good fit, just email us at programs@rsage.org and give us a little blurb and maybe an abstract, and we can tell you whether we think it's going to be a good fit or not.
Someone is asking a proposal, if it's funded by the pipeline project, can you still be considered for research grants? Yeah, absolutely. There's no limit as to how many grants you could receive after you receive a pipeline grant. It's just not the other way around. Like, for instance, you have to not have been awarded a grant from RSF in the past to be eligible for the pipeline grants program. But afterward, you can definitely apply for a research grant if you'd like.
I want to respond to Professor Murmer's question about seeking funding for visiting an institution in the US. This isn't actually something that the foundation does a lot. We are funding research projects. We're not funding like research leave or something like that for you to visit another institution in the US. The only thing we do for sort of folks looking to be visitors or to be on sabbatical is our own in-house visiting scholars program. So the other things are mostly for the research itself, not for the visit. All right, I think the Q&A has sort of slowed down. I'll just reiterate, please email us. That's what we're here for. The programs@rsage.org email address is really gonna be, hopefully be your friend. You can send us an abstract. You can try to set up an appointment with one of us. And oh, I can answer these two that just popped in. Course releases are considered for pipeline grants regardless of your teaching load or anything. They are specifically allowed. We're recognizing that early on in your careers, you need time to do the research, so we'll pay for a course release. For the research grants, like the LOIs, the larger research grants, they're on a case-by-case basis. Like if you're at a particularly heavy load, or if there's a particularly timely event that you need to do the research for, we may consider them. But for the pipeline grants, they're considered all the time. In regards to an analytic plan, we're really talking about like how you're going to analyze the data that you're collecting. We just want to see what the plan is. That can be sort of dependent on the type of data that you're collecting, but I would consider that all sort of part of the more holistic research design. Like, these are the data I'm going to collect. These are the methods that we're going to apply to them, and this is how we're going to analyze all of that data.
All right, if there are one more question. Does RSF fund data intensive and complex modeling and quantitative methods for social questions? I would say probably. I would have to know more information, of course, but you can always send us an email and we can suss it out later on. But there's no reason from what you said that we wouldn't be able to fund something like that.
Yeah, I encourage everyone with like project specific, like how about my project? How about this one? I really encourage you to reach out to us, and you can give us a little bit more detail. So we're not just sort of being like, maybe. We can really get into the nitty gritty if you send us an abstract or something like what you plan on applying for. But yeah, I think that's probably good. Thank you all for joining us. I don't know, Eric, do you have anything left to say?
No, just thanks everybody for joining us, and hope you have a great rest of your week.